All right, I'd like to welcome you to today's lecture entitled Good Night Liberalism by Barton Swaim. I'm Aaron Zubia. I teach political thought in the Department of Politics and International Affairs. This lecture is sponsored by the Tocqueville Program, which is devoted to free, reasoned inquiry into life's most important questions, particularly those moral and philosophic questions at the heart of political life. If you are interested in an intellectual community that seeks the truth about the enduring questions, the philosophic questions, the permanent questions of God, nature, and the human person, then the Tocqueville Program is for you. If you are serious, if you want to challenge, then the Tocqueville Program is for you. If you want to inquire freely about liberty, justice, and equality, about truth, goodness, and beauty, then the Tocqueville Program is for you. If you want to engage in unhindered inquiry about these topics in a way that draws from the Western tradition, then come to the Tocqueville Program. We want you to engage with us, and you will learn how to think rather than what to think, and you will practice the art of civil discourse. If you would like to learn more about the Tocqueville Program and what we do, you can contact me, you can sign up for one of our courses, you can apply for the Society of Tocqueville Fellows, or you can visit our Political Thought Club, which meets every Friday at 4 p.m. It's a fun crowd to be around, and we welcome you. It's always a good time. Now, the work of the Tocqueville Program is made possible by the generous gifts of individuals and philanthropic organizations who, along with those of us in the Tocqueville Program, believe that genuine liberal education encourages students to become more thoughtful citizens and dignified human beings. I want to thank our sponsors, Ginny and Sandy McNeil, Beth and Ravenel Curry, the AWC Foundation, the family of Jane Gage Hipp, the Strada Education Network, Mary and Bill Howes, Linda Gilkerson, and many others, including former students of the Tocqueville Program. And now, I'd like to tell you a little bit about our speaker, Barton Swaim. Barton Swaim is a native South Carolinian who attended the University of South Carolina and received his PhD in English literature from the University of Edinburgh. Mr. Swaim's first book, Scottish Men of Letters in the New Public Sphere, 1802 to 1834, was published in 2009. And Mr. Swaim's second book, The Speechwriter, was published in 2015. In that book, Mr. Swaim writes about his experience as a communications officer and speechwriter for former South Carolina Governor Mark Sanford. You may remember him. I know I do. 10 years ago, in 2012, Mr. Swaim began writing book reviews for the Wall Street Journal. His column on political books began in 2017. A former contributing columnist for the Washington Post and opinion editor of the Weekly Standard magazine, Mr. Swaim has served as the journal's editorial page writer since 2018. Now, if you are not familiar with Mr. Swaim's writings, I encourage you to get familiar. They are by turns enlightening and entertaining, and they are always thought-provoking, as I know today's lecture will be. Today, Mr. Swaim will be delivering remarks on the state of liberalism in America, and we are happy to have him. Please give a warm welcome to Mr. Barton Swaim.
Now, can I be heard all right? Okay. Well, I want to start by thanking the Tocqueville Program and Aaron, and it was really the Tocqueville Program was one of the things that made me happy about sending my oldest daughter to Furman. She's a student now. Back in 2019, I think, we visited the campus, and on one of these displays, I saw a Tocqueville Program brochure, read it, was impressed, and I thought that whatever Lindsay wanted to study, I felt good about any institution that housed such a program. And Lindsay came to Furman and promptly wanted nothing to do with politics, which is understandable, but I'm so impressed with the program and past speakers and all I know of it. I've actually been to one event before and loved it. Tonight's talk I originally called Good Night Liberalism because I thought it sounded catchy at the time. But I've since changed the title to The Imagined Dragons of Liberalism. The word liberal must be one of the most confusing terms in all of politics. Everyone in this room is a liberal in some sense, unless you are a communist or a totalitarian of some identity. But in a narrower sense, some of you are conservatives and not liberals, and a few of you may be neither conservative nor liberal. Then there is the oddity that in Europe, the liberals on economic matters are what Americans call conservatives. It's all hopelessly confusing, but we are stuck with the word for the simple reason that there's really not a better one. So before we get to the argument I want to make today, let's make clear what in the world we are talking about when we say the word liberalism. First, liberalism in the older, broader sense. Liberalism describes the sort of government that emerged in the aftermath of the European conflicts of the 17th century. The term is, like classicism or romanticism or modern, a description applied by historians to earlier ages. No one woke up one day and said, we're finally in the age of liberalism. Like all such terms, it is clumsy and it leaves a lot unexplained. Nevertheless, we need some word to describe the general course of European political life, beginning in the late 16th and 17th centuries, and liberalism works well enough. After the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648, and after the Glorious Revolution in 1688, European nations began pushing ultimate or metaphysical questions to the private spheres of conscience and individual behavior, and reserving the public sphere, to the extent that was possible, to the practical matters of commerce and living peaceably together. Now, in private and in the local associations in which you operated, you could believe whatever you wanted about the Lord's Supper or the Trinity. In public, you were a loyal citizen to the state. That, in grossly oversimplified form, is the ideal to which Hobbes looked forward in Leviathan and Locke in the two treatises. Of course, things never worked as smoothly as that. Public and private questions were not and are not so easily distinguished, as liberal theory suggested. The neutral public sphere was always an impossible ideal and never a reality. You can pursue whatever narrow ideological goal you like and claim to be the neutral one, but that doesn't make you any more truly liberal than the neighborhood street preacher or the communist revolutionary. Still, the liberal ideal generated some impressive traditions in European and especially Anglo-American societies. The rule of law and due process, freedoms of speech and of press, property rights, separation of powers, religious freedom. These were the achievements of the liberal regimes of Europe and America from the 17th century to the 20th. Imperfectly and inconsistently realized, to be sure, but they were real achievements. Now, you will notice that the great political principles of liberalism I just listed all assume the impossibility of any once and for all solution. The point of the rule of law is that we will all continue to disagree about important things, but that we all must follow the law, whatever it happens to be. The freedom of speech and the freedom of the press both assume that people will have contrasting ideas about what is right and wrong. Both assume that humans, if allowed to do so, will try to shut each other up. Property rights were invented because people are always ready to take your property from you and use it for, as they think, morally unquestionable purposes. The only reason you need separation of powers is that when powerful people do bad things, it's best if other powerful people try to stop them. Historians sometimes call this older ideal procedural or formal liberalism. But something changed a little more than a century ago. In the 1900s and 1910s, at the height of the progressive era in American politics, liberalism became coercive and utopian in a way that it had not been before. It didn't happen all at once. Procedural liberalism still mostly prevailed in the country's two main parties, but the idea animating progressivism was that liberal-minded people could use the power of government to force liberal ideas into existence. That, for progressives, is what progress meant. If there was an injustice in the world, if something was not as it should be, government, and typically the federal government, had a duty to use its power to alleviate that injustice. I'm speaking as a critic of progressivism, but I don't think that's too unfair. Hence the explosion in the number of state and federal government agencies in the early decades of the 20th. You know, we often think of the explosion of governmental powers being a product of the New Deal in the 30s and 40s, but it happened much earlier than that, and the New Deal itself would not have happened were it not for a pre-existing superstructure of government agencies. Government, in this new iteration of liberalism, wouldn't simply allow people to pursue their interests and hold their own beliefs and make themselves wealthy if they knew how. Government would, in this view, itself create prosperity and establish equality by force of law. Woodrow Wilson was the great exponent of this more coercive liberalism. Wilson's expressions of collectivism are still pretty shocking to read. In his 1913 campaign book, The New Freedom, he called himself and his fellow progressive leaders architects of a new society. Eventually, he wrote, "We will remove the scaffolding." This is a kind of creepy bit. "Eventually, we will remove the scaffolding from this society, and there will be the family in a great building whose noble architecture will at last be disclosed, where men can live in a single community, cooperative as in a perfect coordinated beehive." Ugh. Elsewhere, Wilson spoke of the U.S. Constitution as something that, quote, could be stripped off and thrown aside like a garment. It was Wilson, remember, who famously had journalists arrested for criticizing government policy, among the most egregious of his departures from the older liberal ideals. Progressivism was a new sort of liberalism. Calvin Coolidge, who assumed the presidency upon the death of Woodrow's successor, Warren Harding, sensed something deeply amiss in this new liberalism, which he called the spirit of radicalism. "It consists," he wrote in his autobiography, "of the claim in general that in some way the government was to be blamed because everybody was not prosperous, because it was necessary to work for a living, and because our written constitutions, the legislatures, and the courts protected rights of private owners." The New Deal, in which the federal government assumed enormous powers to bring about a new, more equitable economy, ratified this new liberalism. In 1937, former President Herbert Hoover, admittedly still sore about his loss to FDR, complained bitterly that the New Deal, quote, had corrupted the label of liberalism for collectivism coercion, and concentration of political power. Hoover was not wrong. Liberalism of the 1930s and 40s could result in some appallingly illiberal policies, from forced sterilizations to the internment of Japanese Americans. By the end of the Second World War, liberalism had changed its meaning, not completely, but substantially. That's when conservatives began to refer to classical liberalism, to distinguish the older liberal ideal in which government kept the peace and applied the rules to everybody from a new coercive liberalism in which state power imposed liberal ideals. And the meaning of liberal shifted according to the whims of technocrats. Self-identifying liberals, in short, thought the role of government was to bring about things they valued by means of governmental power, full employment, prosperity for all, racial equality, economic parity. These are not bad goals, all of them. This outlook is sometimes called substantive liberalism to distinguish it from procedural liberalism, but I prefer the term modern liberalism because it's simpler. So whereas the older liberalism sought to limit metaphysical beliefs in the good as much as possible to the realm of conscience and private behavior, modern liberalism defined the good as whatever right-thinking educated liberals favored at the moment and sought to impose their vision on society in general. In the post-war years, liberals embraced basically four ideals. One, the equitable redistribution of wealth. Two, personal autonomy. Three, freedom of speech. And four, expanding political rights and the franchise to formerly excluded populations. So you see, there's a lot of overlap between modern liberalism and the older liberalism, but there's also a great departure from it. What I want to suggest to you tonight is that as a source of ideas, modern liberalism is dead, or at least close to death. It is the victim of its own political success and substantive failure. Modern liberalism, if it's to thrive, must always be producing new ideas, but it hasn't produced a genuinely new idea in more than 50 years. Let's go through the four areas I mentioned. Wealth redistribution. The last great triumphs of welfare state liberalism happened during the administration of Lyndon B. Johnson. The Food Stamp Act of 1964 and the Social Security Amendments of 1965, which created Medicaid and Medicare. The Affordable Care Act of 2009 might be a counterexample, but I don't think so. It was a requisitioning of the private insurance market and changed very little about American life other than making medical care slightly more expensive and much more complicated. Personal autonomy is the second area. It's true that liberals have won two major victories on personal autonomy in the post-war years: abortion rights in 1973 and same-sex marriage in 2015. But both of these came about as a result of court decisions, and neither could have passed the U.S. Congress. The Supreme Court recently invalidated the 1973 decision for the simple reason that it was a constitutional fiasco and sent the abortion question back to the people. The third area is free speech. The best evidence that liberals are out of ideas is that they are busy regressing on the ones they used to have. Liberals since John Stuart Mill have espoused freedom of speech almost as a matter of religious faith. But one now finds astonishingly few people on the political left prepared to defend it in a principled way, and quite a few urging government and corporations to censor unpopular views. This may be because liberals now dominate the public sphere in a way they did not before. The winners are always more inclined to silence the losers than vice versa. But it's still true that liberals have given up almost completely on the idea of free speech. Most of them no longer see much of a problem with campus speech codes, and liberals often seem to believe that the First Amendment's guarantee of free speech applies to everything but political speech. Artistic expression, pornography, violent videos, yes. Campaign ads, no. Now, the fourth and final area, expansion of rights. Again, the last great achievements of rights expansion occurred more than half a century ago. Of course, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Once the apparatus of segregation fell, there weren't very many more ways to afford new political rights to formerly oppressed groups. We can add new identities to the Civil Rights Act, and we have done so, but in practice these changes affect very little about American life. We can add transgender identity to the Civil Rights Act, but the plain truth is that transgender people already have the right to vote, and there are very few circumstances in which a transgender person will be fired for his or her identity or refused a table at a restaurant. As for voting rights, stories of large-scale voter intimidation and suppression are not credible. Americans of all kinds are voting in record numbers. Now, my aim here is not actually to denigrate liberalism, although it may sound that way. It is to point out that modern American liberalism accomplished the last of its great aims more than 50 years ago. The Clean Air Act of 1970, the Clean Water Act of 1972 may count as liberal achievements, but not great ones. The creation of the Federal Department of Education in 1979 counts for very little, I would say, since hardly anyone knows what the Department of Education does. And that's about it. The only other monumental measure signed by a liberal president in the name of liberal values was the 1996 Welfare Reform Act, and its aim was to curb liberalism's excesses. Now, some of liberalism's aims were successful, the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Some were and remain disastrous failures. The web of welfare programs and agencies associated with the Great Society have cost trillions of dollars and have not had an appreciable effect on poverty. Worse, they have not promoted economic parity between black and white Americans, which was their de facto goal. Indeed, there is much evidence that African American social and economic progress faltered with the onset and full implementation of the Great Society in the early 1970s and since. Now, where does this leave liberals? It leaves them, as Kenneth Minogue foresaw nearly 60 years ago, looking for dragons to slay. This is the opening passage of his book, The Liberal Mind, published in 1963. Minogue meant liberal in the older sense as it had developed into the newer liberalism of mid-century. He wrote, "The story of liberalism, as liberals tell it, is rather like the legend of St. George and the dragon. After many centuries of hopelessness and superstition, St. George, in the guise of rationality, appeared in the world somewhere about the 16th century. The first dragons upon whom he turned his lance were those of despotic kingship and religious intolerance. These battles won, he rested for a time until such questions as slavery or prison conditions or the state of the poor began to command his attention. During the 19th century, his lance was never still, prodding his way and this way and that against the inert scaliness of privilege, vested interest, or patrician insolence. But unlike St. George, he did not know when to retire. The more he succeeded, the more he became bewitched with the thought of a world free of dragons. and the less capable he became of ever returning to private life. He needed his dragons. He could only live by fighting for causes: the people, the poor, the exploited, the colonial oppressed, the underprivileged, and the underdeveloped. As an aging warrior, he grew breathless in pursuit of smaller and smaller dragons, for the big dragons were now harder to come by. The situation has not changed in the intervening decades since Minow wrote those words. Liberalism's dragons have continued to diminish in size, and it is left without much to do. But stasis is intolerable for liberalism, which is a restless philosophy. It must always be doing something. To rest, or to express satisfaction with the state of things, is to become conservative. That liberalism has nothing much to do anymore is, I think, why 21st century liberals have begun calling themselves progressives. There is substantive transformation behind the change in name. It is also, I think, why the American left today has lunged for so many plainly illiberal positions: Medicare for all, the Green New Deal, racial reparations, abolition of the police. But the most telling sign that liberals need something to do, some dragon to slay, is that they keep inventing fictional dragons. I'm going to list 3 items, but there are more. I see everyone's awake now. Number 1, in 2016, an array of famous liberals, including top-level academics and journalists, talked themselves into believing that the election of Donald Trump signaled the re-emergence of fascism in America. Now, whatever you think about the 45th president, and my own views are pretty skeptical, that was a preposterous delusion. Number 2, last year, when the Georgia legislature partially reverted state election law to the pre-pandemic status quo, President Joe Biden called the move sick and un-American and Jim Crow 2.0 and the most significant test of our democracy since the Civil War. It was a discreditable moment in American history, and it was only right that the Atlanta Braves went on to win the World Series that year, and the Georgia Bulldogs went on to win the national championship. Serve them right. Number 3, progressive advocacy groups across the country have been frightening their constituents with the prospect of book bans because parents in some school districts have asked why some books, generally works of young adult fiction containing sexually edgy content, are on the shelves of school libraries. No, I'm sorry, but the fact that a certain book is not found on the shelves of a publicly funded middle school library is not evidence that the book has been banned. If you can order it on Amazon or buy it at Barnes & Noble, it is not banned. Fascism, Jim Crow, and book bans. These are the non-existent dragons. There are others. They are not things that a normal person should give a thought to, but together they have exercised the imaginations of millions of self-identifying liberals. This need to destroy an enemy helps to explain the enthusiasm with which the #resistance flung itself in blind irrational hatred at Donald Trump. And it helps to explain the furor with which the political left, animated by public health orthodoxy, waged an ill-conceived and counterproductive war, their word war, against COVID-19. The price of these follies was a pointless 2-year investigation into the crime of collusion with Russia, and equally pointless nationwide school closures and business shutdowns. Today's liberals, inheritors of the great liberal tradition of Europe and Anglo-America, need something to thunder against, something to destroy. But the things they're finding to destroy are not fitting topics of grown-up conversation. In closing, I want to suggest something liberals or progressives might thunder against and destroy, with great profit to the nation and honor to themselves. I speak of the orthodoxy of racial justice that consists in more and greater expansions of the welfare state. This is the usually unstated axiom of modern liberalism itself, and so I am not optimistic that my plea will be answered with positive enthusiasm. In order to slay this dragon, liberals would first have to engage in some serious self-criticism, and I have no confidence that that is possible. But self-corrections have happened in the past, and so I mention it. Liberals interested in making society more equitable might train their guns on race orthodoxy in this country. To adhere to this orthodoxy, you must believe in the goodness of expanding state and federal welfare bureaucracies and programs, no matter what the evidence: Medicaid, food stamps, unemployment insurance, Head Start, public housing, and so on. And you must also believe that more money for public schools is always in the best interests of minority children. To oppose these beliefs opens you to the charge, veiled or explicit, of racism. This liberal orthodoxy has defined discourse on race in the US for more than 40 years. It has become dangerous to depart from it. But how has liberal orthodoxy served Black Americans? I would say not well. The end of Jim Crow and voter suppression in the 1960s was a righteous and necessary realization of political equality, implicit in the great liberal principles of centuries before. But the orthodoxy of the 1970s and beyond was something else, and no one can honestly call it a success. Black Americans as a whole lag far behind in income levels and educational attainment and opportunities, and they are both victims and perpetrators of more crimes than whites. One possible response is to assert that America is systemically racist. I can appreciate that response, not because I think it's true, but because it is premised on the realization that the race orthodoxy of the post-war years is a lie, or at least untrue. But I do not believe America is systemically racist. In any case, at a societal level, the lack of parity between the races is not the fault of Black Americans. It is the fault of white liberals who, despite mountains of evidence that the welfare state had failed, insisted on expanding its reach year after year after year. Why this intransigent need to preserve the orthodoxy? I fear the answer is that the orthodoxy made white people feel better. So to recap, modern liberalism is the belief that liberal values may be forced on the nation by governmental power. Its chief problem today is that it has accomplished all it can accomplish by its chosen means. It has sometimes succeeded and often failed, but the point today is it has nothing left to do. And now, bereft of monsters to slay, liberals find themselves charging at dragons that don't exist. What is the future of the liberal order? I do not know, but I am encouraged to think that young Americans in the 2020s will not be satisfied for much longer with slaying non-existent dragons. My hope is that they are sufficiently courageous to dismantle the worst parts of modern liberalism and search out ancient and biblical wisdom for what might come after. And who knows, they may return to the insight of an older liberalism and conclude that it is unwise to let one vision of the good predominate over all the rest. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. It is now time for question and answer. We have a microphone in the back, and I will be directing Mr. Anderson, who has the microphone. So if you have questions, and you have a good amount of time for question and answer, please raise your hand, and I will select you. Raise them high, and we do begin with students and keep your hands up so that I can see, but just so you know, the tradition is to begin with students. If I see a hand here, and a hand here, and a hand back there. So Parker, come on this way. And I saw this hand up first, right here in the second row.
What do you mean by racial orthodoxy? Can you just explain it?
The belief that there is only one way to all right, how's this? No? I'm off now?
Oh,
How about there? Okay, I'll just cock my head like this as I talk. Or I'll talk loud. How about that? I'm in favor of talking loud. What I mean by race orthodoxy is simply, it's a political belief, a belief common in politics, that if you want to deal with the lack of parity between the races, the only way to do it is expand welfare agencies, increase funding for programs. It's always a governmental answer, always. And to question that belief opens you to the charge of racism. That's all I mean by it in a sentence.
All right, great. Next hand right here. Gentleman in blue shirt.
Thank you again for coming. I was just curious if you could elaborate more on how kind of the liberal mindset transformed from one in which the ACLU would defend the rights of neo-Nazis to speak in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood in Skokie to now the ACLU calls for speech codes and restrictions on what people can say. I was just hoping you could maybe shed light on how we arrived at that point.
Yes, somehow there's probably 12 different answers to that question that are helpful and sane. But somehow liberalism did become coercive and sure of the capital G good in a way that former liberals didn't. I mean, it's a great example of the freedom of speech, because if you believe in the freedom of speech, by definition you believe that other people with whom you disagree are nonetheless legitimate in the public realm. They have a right to speak, and who knows, you may learn from it. I mean, that is the older liberal ideal encapsulated in the freedom of speech. And it was, the old ACLU used to drive people crazy because they would defend Nazis and stuff, as you mentioned, which, you know, we could have a debate about how far you can take freedom of speech. But my view would be that for freedom of speech to mean anything, it has to basically mean political speech. It can't be you know, nude dancing or something. I'm sorry, the Constitution doesn't protect nude dancing. And once you start expanding it to those areas, then it becomes sort of meaningless. You know, anyone can say anything, and I think we arrived at a situation in probably the 1990s sometime when, and especially with the rise of the internet and social media, when there was so much expression of every insane idea that right-thinking, well-intended liberal people, certain of themselves and their own views, had had enough of free speech. And I think you started to see it turn about the turn of the century. But it had to do with the rise of this new coercive attitude in liberalism, which didn't just affect free speech. It affected a lot of areas, and we can talk more about that. It's really interesting to me. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Blue sweatshirt back there.
So how would you say that a more classical liberal mindset could more effectively or further solve problems like that you
How could classical liberalism affect positive change? Is that what you mean? Yeah. Well, classical liberalism isn't the sort of, that's an interesting way to put it, because classical liberalism, as I understand it, isn't designed to solve certain problems. It's designed for people to live peaceably together and to prosper together and to pursue their own traditions and their habits of living together in a way that doesn't conflict with each other. But it's not designed in the way that, say, Marxism or other forms of ideology are designed to fulfill certain goals. So I would be suspicious of arguing that classical liberalism is the answer to, like, climate change. Hopelessly complicated question that is poorly understood, and I'm not sure. Well, no, I take that back. A classical liberal approach to the economy, allowing people greater freedom to buy and sell between nations, across borders, allowing them to develop new technologies with minimal government interference, would create innovative solutions to certain problems, maybe climate change, maybe other problems, in a way that government planning and funding certain innovations does not. Government bureaucrats do not know the best people or institutions to fund to figure out how to solve problems that haven't even occurred yet. There may not be good solutions to those problems, but if there are any, the only way that those innovations and solutions will be found is when certain people produce certain things that other people actually want and are willing to buy in order to solve those problems. But a government bureaucrat right now trying to figure out, hey, I'm gonna load up this this company because they're probably gonna come up with a solution for, like, solar power. It just doesn't work time after time because they don't know what they're doing. I hope that's, like, in the ballpark of an answer.
All right, thank you, Mr. Place in the back, and I see some more hands up.
So I feel like a lot of this discussion centers around liberalism within the context of the political left. But at the same token, I think, especially now in the more extreme elements of the Republican Party, I feel like similar arguments in terms of a much more coercive brand of thinking are also present. So do you think that classical liberalism, as you define it, has any real say within the modern American political spectrum of left and right, or would you say that classical liberalism has kind of more just been abandoned generally?
Closer to the latter than the former. In the Republican Party now, we are faced with a new sort of office holder, aspiring politician who is suspicious of market values because, in their minds, they exploit the American worker and free trade and promote deviant behaviors in the culture. So Maybe somebody like J.D. Vance would be an example. Marco Rubio, who used to be a straight-up classical liberal, decided for a variety of reasons, I think having to do with the success of Donald Trump, that he would become more of sort of a slightly more statist, and we can solve the culture by government policy sort of guy. And I think that on skeptical days, on pessimistic days, I think we are headed for a situation in which both Republican and Democratic parties are their entire goal is to fight over public resources. Who gets what goodies? Who gets what funding? And that's it. I feel like that's the direction we're headed in. I don't know. Things change a lot in politics, but so I would answer with some skepticism.
All right, I've seen, let's see. All right, let's go to the front here. Parker.
So, you just talked about what might happen if Republicans and Democrats fighting over resources, and generally this will come from taxpayers, the Fed, or whatever. But basically, some way in a democratic form, and what they might do is they might try to pander more, and might show some downfall of democracy. And where, in regards to liberalism, do you see democracy being more harmful or helpful? And what's the perfect amount of democracy and voting? On what scale in a healthy liberal society?
Democracy is one of those terms like liberalism, and people mean different things by it. I would have to ask you what you meant by it, but I'm guessing that you mean democracy in the older sense of voting, majority rule. Okay, because today it means like whatever we want. Yeah, the founders were famously suspicious of democracy, which they equated with mob rule, and to my mind, democracy, as you and I would define it, meaning majority rule, you get to vote in elections, the elections have to be fair, and we send representatives to vote, and they vote on stuff, and if we don't like it, we have to vote them out of office. Like, that's democracy. Democracy does not mean, welfare state. We're stuck with that, with the older form of democracy. It just is. And it's interesting to me that, and I'll just pick on liberals one more time, as if I haven't done enough already, that democracy, the attack on democracy is a big subject in this year's election. And of course it refers to the outrage that occurred on January 6th, 2021. And, but the attack on democracy was a theme long for the previous 4 years. Donald Trump was an attack on democracy. Democratic norms, suddenly the word democracy was everywhere. Whereas just before the election of Donald Trump, there were books by transnational elite authors of Europe and America attacking democracy in the sense in which we mean it. There was one, and I'm forgetting the guy's name, Against Democracy was the title. And those books, and there were articles and such, were suspicious of the idea that majorities should rule. And it has to be said that for a long time, liberals, progressives got their way by court decisions. I mentioned two of them, really important court decisions that have profoundly affected American life, came about because some justices said, hey, this is what we think today. This is not democracy. So I am in favor of democracy. I am a small d Democrat, and the American people do many stupid things, and they vote many people into office ill-advisedly. But the alternative is worse, because hyper-educated technocrats do far dumber things, and impose actually malign policies, in my view. So the more democracy, in our sense, the better, would be my view.
Questions are open to all. There's somebody in the middle who's had his hand up for a while. Right over here. I don't know how you're going to. Yeah, they can pass the mic down here.
Hi. So you mentioned that present-day liberalism is constantly fighting dragons that are dwindling in size or have become imaginary and are now made up. So I'd like to ask that if you believe that modern liberalism has failed, then what is the need to create these imaginary dragons, these imaginary issues? If it's failed, then wouldn't there still be real big, massive dragons that it is chasing after?
Yeah, I think that liberalism is premised on, I called it a restless philosophy. It has to be doing something. And I think that's why I quoted the Minot passage, because I think it captures, and he's talking about liberals from the 17th century and forward, but liberals in the sense in which we mean, modern liberals, I think, have inherited that sort of reform-minded. We all to adapt a line from Glengarry Glen Ross, always be reforming. Some things don't actually need to be reformed. Some changes don't need to be made, but the modern liberal mindset is that if anything bad is happening anywhere in the world, then somebody must not have done something right in the government, and that thing must change, so let's go change it. We could psychologize this. Why do we feel that way? And it may be an American thing, or it may be a European thing, or a sort of a Christendom thing. I don't know. It could be an outgrowth of Christianity. Once its scriptural or spiritual element is taken from it, that the Christian person must always be improving, must always be slaying sin or confessing sin, depending on your tradition or whatever, must always be improving. So we as a society feel that we must always be finding the bad thing to destroy. The fact is that if you lived in, I'll just arbitrarily say 1995, and you were a liberal person, life was pretty satisfactory to you. Free speech had gone about as far as it could go. You could say pretty well anything, anywhere. There were exceptions, of course. The one great exception to that would be racial relations. But by and large, if you were a liberal person in 1995, it was a good place to live. America was. You had gotten your way on most things. Liberals dominated the media, the universities, the entertainment industry. They hadn't quite yet dominated corporate boardrooms, but they were on their way. But for some reason, that striving, energetic desire to slay bad things did not wane. I think that the election of Donald Trump, for whom I did not vote, just to be clear, in case you're at all interested, the election of Donald Trump gave new life to that liberal zealotry. here was a dragon, like an actual dragon, and he's like a big dragon, not just one of these small bore things that we could knock out with a sword, but like one we had to do battle with. And I honestly think it sort of gave life for a time to liberalism, and then they pretty much killed it, which is dumb to think of a single politician that way, because eventually they come and they go and then they're forgotten. But that was a powerful moment in the revival of liberalism. That's a very long-winded way of saying I have no idea.
There's a question over here, and while you're traveling over,
The gentleman in the white has his hand up for a while now.
okay, all right, go ahead. And while the microphone's being handed over there, I have a question.
Okay.
You mentioned the fictional book bans, as in, even if they're not permitted on a school library shelves, at the middle school, you can still procure them otherwise, so this really isn't a ban. At the same time, if a public school system decides not to have pornographic literature available to middle school students, how is that different from the kind of coercive liberalism that you're speaking against? I mean, that seems to involve some sort of coercion.
Mhm.
Can we differentiate that at all?
Yeah, if I understand your question, there's always, you can't get away from coercion, right? It's not as though under an ideal classical liberal system of government or worldview, no one would ever be forced to do anything, because if we're to live together peaceably, then some people are going to have to be told, you can't drive over 55 or whatever. That's coercion, it's a law. It doesn't matter if you think you should be able to, you can't, because that's what we all agreed on here. So yes, that is a form of coercion, and it has to do, I think we're thinking about these things more often these days because of the fracturing of values, shared values in society, which is, I'm sure you've thought about and talked about many times. At middle of the last century, American culture is very consolidated. People, and this is sort of totally overgeneralizing, but it gets the point. People watch the same TV shows, they watch the same news anchors, and read the same newspapers, and they went to one of 5 different mainline denominations, which may not have even been called mainline by most people then. And they read the same books. Everybody knew what was on the bestseller list or what the Book of the Month Club was selling. And so you didn't even notice coercion then, because we all sort of agree on a broad range of things. But now when there's just the slightest bit of someone has to make a decision, this and not that, like in a school library, then a lot of people say, oh my God, it's a book ban, fascism, what's happening? And these are simple matters of, prudent policy making. We also don't have, pornographic magazines on the shelf in a middle school library. That's not because we're being coercive, because we want to ban pornography. Some people do, but that's not at issue. It's just because that's a dumb thing to do. Instead, we put it on the laptops for the boys to take home. Different topic. Yes, they can get around the little firewalls you have. So anyway, that's a windy answer again.
Go ahead.
Yes, sir.
So if I understand it correctly, your critique of liberalism is that being progressive and going after certain dragons to slay is coercive. And I guess while I agree with you that slaying imagined dragons can be dangerous, I don't think I fully agree with you on the dragons, but to take it to the right, when the right fearmongers progress and equality and tries to prevent change from occurring talking about putting pornography in middle school libraries. I'm talking about truly making society equal and better for all people. Is that coercive? Should we have the same criticism of the right in that regard?
Possibly. Could you give me an example of that?
That's a great comeback. It's not off the top of my head, but
I mean, I'm certainly willing to say yes. And it may be my own biases. I don't know what you might be thinking of.
well, I mean, I think economic inequality in America.
Mhm.
We've seen since the 1980s, we've seen progress and production go up, and we've seen income levels stay the same. So I think with things like that, like welfare, making sure people can put dinner on the table, we may not agree on what kind of welfare programs we're going to put in place, but to be seeking active solutions to these problems, whether it's racial or economic, I think the right tends to put those down and accept the status quo and coerce all of America into accepting the status quo. And I wonder if you agree to some level with that.
Let's see. My own view would be that the right has no power to coerce anything because it is totally outnumbered, except in the political realm. Republicans are pretty good at getting elected. They're not good at getting themselves in charge of entertainment corporations and universities, high-level bureaucracies. Those are all run by liberals. The only place where conservatives are really good at staying in the game is electoral politics, for a variety of reasons. And to some extent, the judiciary, because Republicans can appoint judges, same as Democrats. But I would only push back at the assumption that conservatives have the ability to coerce, because I just don't think they do. I'm fully prepared to admit that conservatives and Republicans can be wildly inconsistent and insane in their rhetoric in many cases. You mentioned inequality. I would question the premise there on the grounds that when you see economic inequality statistics, what does not go into those statistics are actual welfare payments. So the when the statistics are put out by the Bureau of Labor Statistics and others, what you're looking at does not account for the amount of public money that a recipient gets in the form of food stamps or any number of other welfare payments. If you do account for those, inequality is much less. That is a different debate, but I'm not totally sure where you're going, but I bet we could have a fruitful discussion.
Thank you. We have a hand up right here, and then we'll return to the other side of the room. I see you right there.
The madam in the white?
Yes.
Thank you very much for your honest talk. Can I be, am I heard?
Yes.
First I have a comment and then I have a question. And my comment is in response to that young man over there who was asking why current liberalism, modern liberalism, is searching for dragons
Mm-hmm.
to slay. And I have a thought about that, which is that I think human beings under secular humanism have become pretty arrogant about what we we do. And the belief is that we can create a perfect world if we just put our mind to it. The utopia is at hand if we, and that there are individuals who are smart enough to do that. And the imperfectibility of human beings and the imperfectibility of society is questioned. It's not, and I start with that as an assumption.
Mhm.
That society is going to be imperfect.
Mhm.
It's not possible. And that we human beings are imperfect and do not have the ability to sit back and orchestrate what can work. I think Marxism is a perfect example of that because the idea is so brilliant, that each according to his own need. But the consequence is that people lose motivation and don't want to work when another person isn't working.
Yes.
That was my response to that question. My question is, can you address the World Economic Forum and the ESG standards and stakeholder, what's being used now for stakeholder capitalism versus shareholder capitalism? Can you address those three, ESG standards, World Economic Forum, and stakeholder capitalism versus shareholder capitalism? And what your thoughts are about that, how that relates to your talk today on liberalism.
Yeah, I'll just take it all in one fell swoop. Stakeholder capitalism, as many of you probably know, is to be distinguished from shareholder capitalism. Shareholder capitalism was the idea that corporate decisions, corporate managers were going to make decisions about what their company did based on what was most profitable for the shareholder. This was thought, and this has been going on a long time, it's not like a new thing, although it has a new term now, which makes it all cool, stakeholder capitalism. Doing whatever is best for shareholders was thought to be sort of mean and not solicitous of the environment, and it didn't accomplish common good. And so what we needed was something called stakeholder capitalism, which I never figure out what a stakeholder is. And that's the idea that corporate managers would make decisions based on what was actually good for all of the stakeholders, whoever they are, everybody in society. So the shareholder was, sure, we got to consider the shareholder in the company's decision making, but we're going to make decisions at the corporate level that benefit everybody. And the great problem with that, number one, is that stakeholders turn out to be whatever liberals want. That's what we're going to do, because we think that our liberal progressive ideas are the best for society. So we're just going to fund a host of sort of left-wing nonprofits, and we're going to invest in a lot of climate stuff, and we're going to and on, because that's what's best for the commonality and all of stakeholders. This second problem is that it gets corporate managers off the hook. You can be a corporate manager at whatever, at one of the, Apple or Amazon or whatever, and you can just be not very good at your job. Okay, you're not making good decisions based for the company's profit. But you can say, but I'm not just working for the shareholder, I'm working for the stakeholder. I'm doing stuff for everybody. And stakeholder capitalism becomes just a way for corporate managers who aren't very good at doing what they're supposed to do to sort of make excuses for themselves. And over time, companies become less profitable, less competitive globally and nationally, simply because their managers have an out, and because they can always blame, make excuses based on the stakeholder ideal. And it is rooted in what you're saying, the arrogance of, and I don't want to pick on just liberalism or progressivism, just the arrogance of the contemporary American hyper-educated VIP, to use an overused term, elite, the people who run large corporations, who run large universities, so Furman is off the hook. The people who are making decisions at the highest level of the federal government, they think they know everything. And plain old stakeholder capitalism was sort of, the genius of it was that you didn't need to know how to run the world. You just need to know how to make a good product that people actually want to buy with their own money so that the shareholders can profit. But now, no, you have to have you have to have an MBA, and you have to have this incredible intellectual pedigree, and you have to understand, the entire global market. They don't understand any of that stuff. And it's all, a lot of it is just BS. And it's born of arrogance and a tendency vastly to overestimate the capacity of people to know what they're doing at any one time.
That gentleman down there?
All right, real quick, two-parter here. First of all, would you say that one of your kind of central concerns with modern progressivism is that its adherents force their political beliefs with governmental power? Would you agree with that?
I think so.
Here, if you want me to rephrase it,
Yeah, could you say it again? Or, pretty sure.
would you say that one of your biggest problems with modern liberalism is that it forces its beliefs using governmental power?
Yes.
Okay.
I was afraid it was a trick question. No. Okay.
And then going off of that, kind of, would you say that this kind of imposition of governmental power is like a uniquely progressive trait?
No, I mean, the impulse to use power to push other people around is not uniquely American or uniquely progressive. I think that it, in the context of late 19th and 21st century American politics, the people self-identifying as progressives were more likely to take up governmental power to push people around than were people who didn't use that label.
Okay, so to be clear, you're saying that somebody who held a different political ideology might be less likely to kind of create this orthodoxy of their own ideology than a liberal would?
I think so. I think I would be okay with that way of putting it. I mean there are a lot of ideologies, a lot of labels that people use, and some people are crazy. So I wouldn't want to account for every non-progressive in America. Some people are, neo-Nazis, and some people are whatever. But in the let's confine ourselves to Congress. People who take up the progressive label are much more likely to favor big, bold, robust government interventions that force people to do things than people who do not use that label. Now we can argue, which I think you might be getting at this, that, and Aaron brought this up too, that's not to say that non-progressives never want to use government power that forces people to do things that they wouldn't want to do. But in general, progressives are, I mean, it's what, I think they would agree to this too, from the Wilsonian progressives and today's progressives. They're much more likely to favor government interventions that coerce and impose a certain vision on citizens willing or unwilling.
Okay, so like, do you think progressives are kind of overstepping and making people like follow their ideology?
Yes.
Okay.
One more follow-up here.
Here, I can pass it on. As well.
We can talk afterward if you.
Rachel Shandlin, and then Chris and
Thank you so much for your time tonight. My question is sort of piggybacking off an earlier one, the question about how you suggest that classical liberalism would sort of address problems. And you sort of pointed to, I think, an economic example of, breeding innovation, sort of capitalism breeds innovation, kind of approach of, that might be a solution for problems, if I understand it. But I was wondering, sort of in light of there existing some problems such as climate change or racial inequality that might not have a financial incentive to address like that, at least not until, maybe a point of crisis. What you sort of thought in light of that, and ultimately what would lead to you saying that you maybe favor an ideology that you self-described in a as prone to a state of stasis over one that is sort of tackling dragons, even if you critique those as being insignificant dragons or doing so ineffectively.
Okay, let me try this. I think that on climate change, what are known in the United States as climate policies are typically injurious of economic activity. They tax and they regulate. They keep companies from making profits, or they allow companies to make profits, but then they take a lot of that profit in the form of taxes. Okay, when you do that, you slow economic growth. When economic growth is slower, the likelihood that innovative solutions to things like climate change are less likely to come about. So sure, government can take your money and fund this alleged solution, but in doing that, you are slowing the prosperity-generating power of the economy. And it is almost always the private sector in private association, economic exchanges that come up with solutions to environmental and other problems. I can, hydraulic fracking would be an example off the top of my head. I don't think that that's a government solution. That the government didn't fund that. It was it was people in the private sector. So on race relations, this is an interesting topic to me. The two things that have encouraged racial, I'll use the word harmony. It doesn't sound right, but it's the only one I can think of. Two things have encouraged positive racial relations in America that never get credit for it. One is business, and two is sports. neither of those things is government. I'm not saying that government has done nothing. Okay, I mentioned the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. Those are right and necessary things. I did criticize all the government policies springing out of the Great Society that were meant to balance racial parity and failed. But those two things that I mentioned, business. So where I live, there's a plumbing store. It sells plumbing parts, and mainly the people who go in there are plumbers, professional plumbers, and I am not one. But anytime we have a plumbing problem around the house or whatever, I sort of fancy that I can fix it. And I like to go there. It's a cool place. It's called Capital City Supply. And I don't know, it's weird, but I just like going there. And, looking for parts, and they always have a part, and they're the coolest guys that work there. And what strikes me every time I go there is that half the people in there, both workers and customers, half are white and half are black. And they're all there sort of mixing and mingling and talking about parts. And a lot of the black plumbers who are there, they work for other black plumbers. It's a black community. But they all come together, and I actually don't know if the owner of this place is black or white. But it's this like wonderful sphere of private economic activity in which blacks and whites are negotiating with each other and kind of jiving with each other and joking and making crazy comments because it's a bunch of guys. And it's wonderful. And the same happens in sporting events. The thing that this is kind of some people might object to me saying this, but what brought races together in places like Louisiana was the LSU football team allowing blacks to play. That's when magically white people thought, hey, this is not so bad. Segregation was really dumb. And in a lot of, in that whole realm of sports, that's a realm that you can go to. You can go to your church basketball league, as I do, or college football or whatever, and the races are mingling in this wonderful way. But it's not government policy making them do that. It's just private economic activity, mutually benefiting, but interacting in a wonderful way. That may not answer your question, but it's my best shot.
Just to clarify on the subject of climate change policy, you would argue that current restrictions such as taxes and everything are so restrictive to the economy, and that innovation related to climate change is so inevitable that it would ultimately be more beneficial to remove these restrictions.
Yes, in general, yes. Mm.
So if we assume that liberalism has basically run its course and that the government has all of this pent-up energy and motivation to continue fighting dragons, small or imaginary, then what's next? In what ways does the structure of government need to change to improve the situation?
That is the the trillion-dollar question, and I don't know the answer. I think that it is it will take. It's a multi-generational project to figure out how liberalism needs to change. It may need to. It may need to. I mean, I would favor reverting to a kind of older ideal, but we're stuck with this massive government apparatus, and it's not going away. Okay, we can talk about the harm that the Great Society did, but all those institutions, those agencies, programs are not going away. No one's going to fire. No one's going. Republicans get elected talking about reducing the size of government. It doesn't happen. And it's not because they were lying when they said that. It's because it's just impossible to do. There's a famous line by the great South Carolina Senator and Secretary of State, Jimmy Burns, that nothing comes as close to immortality as a government bureau. They used to call agencies bureaus. And these, I don't know what to do about it, but I think I have faith in the American people that with each successive generation, Americans will do dumb things, but they don't keep doing dumb things as a rule over the course of generations. I interviewed a guy recently, David Mamet, who's a playwright, and he had this wonderful summation that was sort of hard to understand when he said it, but the more I thought about it, it was pretty brilliant. He said, people don't change, people die. And what he meant was no one changes their mind. No one says, you know what, my whole life has been a waste. I think I'll, revert and change my mind and work to undo all the things I did. I mean, there are a few instances of people switching philosophies, neoconservatism, they were all Trotskyists who became conservative, so on. But mostly people don't change, but they do die. And when they die, new people take their place. And those people say, you know what they did was dumb. I think we'll do it a different way. And so I do have, I love this country, and I do think that we don't persist in doing dumb things for too many generations before things begin to change.
All right. On that, I think that qualifies as a hopeful comment.
Yeah, okay,
I think
okay,
so.
all right. Thank you all.
Please give a round of applause for Barton Swaim. There's food outside.
Oh, really?
So please go out there and enjoy.
Thank you. Yes, sir. That's a process there. Yeah. You never know what's coming.
Yeah. I'm not going to be able to join.